Montana Territory, late September, 1883. The wind had teeth that morning when Quillan Pierce rode into the hollow near the abandoned whitewashed church. The land rolled wide and gold under the weight of early frost, and his horses' hooves clipped against the dry dirt like a ticking clock. He had no reason to stop. He was headed north to Fort Benton, his saddlebag light and his mind quieter than it had been in years, but something caught his eye. A figure, slumped against the peeling steps of the old church. He pulled the reins. "Easy," he said low to the gelding, then dismounted, boots crunching over brittle grass. As he got closer, he saw it was a woman, young, pale as snow. Her skirts were muddy and torn near the hem, her bonnet hanging by one string. She was barely conscious, her breath shallow. She collapsed outside the old church. He dropped to a knee beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse, weak but there. Her lips were dry and cracked, and her hands trembled even in her stillness. "Miss," he said, voice low. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered, then opened just enough for him to see they were the color of stormy water. She tried to speak, but only a rough whisper came out. "Please, help." "I've got you," Quillan said, already shrugging out of his coat. He wrapped it around her and lifted her carefully into his arms. She was light, too light. He could feel her ribs through her dress. He carried her to his horse, feeling her head fall against his chest. Something about the way she leaned into him, even in her half-conscious state, it pulled at him hard, like a hook in his chest. He had no reason to care, but he did. He felt her pull. He rode fast, clutching her close as the wind picked up. There was a homestead about 6 miles south where a retired nurse lived, Miss Ryland. He remembered. She had patched him up once after a bar fight in Helena. If anyone could help this woman, it would be her. By the time they reached the small cabin, the woman in his arms had gone still. Not lifeless, just quiet, as if every breath she took was a decision. Miss Ryland opened the door before he could knock. "Quillan Pierce," she said, brows lifting. "What have you gone and dragged in now?" "She collapsed near the old church," he said, stepping inside. "She needs help." Miss Ryland's eyes softened when she saw the woman. "Lay her down over there." He did. The old nurse worked fast, pulling off the muddy boots, checking for fever, spooning water into her mouth. Quillan stood back, arms crossed, jaw working. He had not meant to stay. But he could not leave. "She is starved," Miss Ryland said after a time. "Dehydrated. I think she has been walking for days." "Did she say anything?" "Not yet. She needs rest." "I'll wait." Miss Ryland gave him a long look but said nothing. Quillan stayed through the night. He sat on the floor near the cot, listening to her breathe. She stirred once, her fingers twitching, her lips moving. He leaned close. "Where?" she murmured. "You are safe. Just rest." Her eyes opened again, and this time they stayed open. She blinked up at him. "Who are you?" "Name's Quillan Pierce. Found you near the church." She frowned, like she was trying to remember something. "I was looking for someone." He waited. "My brother used to write me about that place," she said, her voice hoarse. "Said it was peaceful. I thought maybe. I thought he'd be there." Quillan looked down. "You are far from anywhere. What is your name?" She swallowed. "Keziah Kline." He nodded. "You are safe now, Keziah." Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "I did not think anyone would stop." He held her gaze. "I did." Keziah slept again, and Quillan sat back, watching her chest rise and fall. She had a quiet strength about her, even in sleep. He could feel it. The next morning she was stronger. Miss Ryland gave her broth, and Keziah drank it with both hands wrapped around the bowl. Her voice was steadier when she spoke. "I came from Idaho," she said, eyes on the fire. "My brother was the only family I had left. He stopped sending letters last winter. I waited, but they never came, so I came looking." Quillan said nothing for a moment. "That church, there is no one left near there." "I know," she said softly. I saw, but I had nowhere else to go. He looked at her and she looked back, really looked, like she saw something in him he had not shown in a long time. I am not looking for charity, she said. I just need a place to start again. You do not owe me anything, Keziah, she nodded. Still, thank you, Quillan stood. I have a small cabin near the river. It is empty most of the time. You could rest there, just until you are ready. Her eyes widened slightly. You would offer that to a stranger. You do not feel like a stranger. She stared at him then, and something moved between them, something quiet but strong, like the start of something neither of them had expected. I will go, she said. If it truly is no trouble. It is not. He helped her onto his horse again, slower this time. She held to him tighter, and this time he held her like she belonged there. They rode north along the river, the air sharp with the scent of pine and cold water. His cabin sat tucked behind a line of aspens, small but warm. He helped her down and lit the stove while she warmed her hands. She turned to him, her cheeks flushed. Why are you helping me? He looked at her, really looked. Because I want to. Keziah stepped closer. You do not even know me. I will, he said. She smiled then, just a little, but it reached her eyes, and Quillan knew he was not going anywhere. The first snow came early that year, falling soft and steady through the bare limbs above Quillan's cabin. Inside, the walls held the heat from the wood stove, and the scent of spruce kindling lingered in the air. Keziah sat near the hearth, her knees drawn up beneath a patched wool blanket, watching the snow through the window with quiet eyes. Quillan had just come back from checking the traps he'd set along the creek. He shook the flakes from his shoulders, hung his coat on the peg by the door, and set a small bundle of rabbits on the table. His sleeves were damp to the elbows, his hands raw from the cold. You don't have to do all that alone, Keziah said, her voice soft, but the words carried. I've done it alone a long while, he replied, pulling a chair out with his boot. But I don't mind sharing it now. She reached for the kettle hanging above the fire and poured hot water into the tin basin on the table. Let me clean those, she said, nodding toward the rabbits. You know how. I helped my father dress game when I was a girl. He never did believe in raising idle daughters. Quillan leaned back slightly, watching her as she rolled up her sleeves and took a knife from the hook by the stove. Her hands were steadier now, her shoulders holding more weight. That fragile look she'd worn when he first found her had been replaced with something firmer. You always live in the mountains? She asked without looking up. Not always this one, he said. I used to ride cattle drives down through Wyoming. Spent a year working a line camp near Miles City. This place found me after. Why'd you stay? He hesitated, then answered. Didn't have much reason to be anywhere else. She paused in her work, glancing over. I know that feeling, he nodded once. They fell into a quiet rhythm. She cleaned the rabbits while he carved a new handle for the kettle hook. Outside, the light shifted, snow laying down thick along the roof. The stillness between them wasn't empty, it held weight, the kind that builds when two people listen without needing to speak. After supper, Keziah folded her blanket and stood slowly, testing her balance. I want to walk, she said, just to the edge of the trees. You sure you're strong enough? She met his eyes. I won't know until I try. He took his coat from the peg and held it open for her. She stepped into it, her fingers brushing his as she pulled it close. They stepped outside together, boots crunching over the packed snow. The wind had quieted. The pines stood still, tall and black against the deepening blue of the sky. Quillan walked beside her without speaking, letting her set the pace. She stopped near a ridge where the trees opened wide, revealing the creek below, frozen over in bands of silver and white. I used to think if I just kept walking far enough, I might find something that made the rest of it make sense, she said. But I never expected it to be a cabin in the woods with a stranger." He looked out over the trees. "You're not a stranger anymore." She turned toward him. "What are you then?" He didn't answer right away. There was no rush in him. Finally, he said, "I don't know what I'm becoming, but I know I'd rather find that out with someone than alone." She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. "I was raised to believe a woman needed to be useful," she said. "To earn her place. I'm not sure how to just be taken in like this." "You're not being taken in. You're being seen." They stood there as the sky deepened, breath rising in clouds. Then she reached out and touched his hand briefly but deliberate. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just turned his palm up so her fingers could settle there. When they walked back, side by side, her gait was steadier. He opened the door for her, and she stepped inside, the firelight catching the edge of her jaw, the loose braid down her back. She didn't let go of his hand until they were both beside the hearth again. "You've given me more than shelter," she said quietly. "I don't want to take without giving." "You're not," he said. "You're here." "That's enough." She lowered herself onto the floor cushion by the fire, pulling her feet beneath her. He sat beside her, close but not crowding. The silence returned, but it held something new now: permission. Through the window, the snow kept falling. Inside, the warmth settled deep. And between them, something quiet and true began to take root. By late October, the creek behind the cabin had frozen solid, and Keziah began tending the stove each morning before Quillan returned from his early ride. She moved with quiet purpose now, not like someone passing through, but like someone making room to stay. The rhythm between them had settled without design. She milked the goat Miss Ryland had brought over from her own shed, and he split wood in the clearing behind the smokehouse. They didn't speak much in the early hours, but their silences held a kind of ease neither had known before. One evening, after the sky bruised into dusk, Quillan came in with a length of cedar and set it down by the hearth. Keziah was bent over the table sewing a new lining into one of his winter shirts. She finished the seam before raising her eyes. "You always ride out before sun up," she said. "You looking for something?" He sat on the floor beside the cedar and drew a small blade from his belt. "Not looking. Just keeping watch. There's a trap line south of the ridge I've been checking." She threaded her needle again. "You don't set traps that far from the cabin, not unless you're tracking something." He ran the blade along the grain, slow and careful. "There's been cougar sign near the ravine." "Tracks too fresh to ignore." She set her stitching aside. "You go out alone?" "I do." "Doesn't that worry you?" He glanced up. "It used to, doesn't now." She folded her hands in her lap. "You talk like a man who's already decided what happens next." "I talk like a man who's seen enough to know most things can't be planned." Keziah stood and walked to the woodpile in the corner. She picked up a split log and set it on the fire. "When I was 12, I found a coyote snared in one of my father's wire loops. Its leg was broken, but it hadn't given up. It bit me when I tried to free it." He looked over, one brow raised. "I didn't blame it," she continued. "I still have the scar. Was your father angry you tried?" She crouched beside the fire. "He said I was foolish, but he was the one who taught me not to leave anything suffering." Quillan set down the cedar. "That's not foolish." She turned toward him. "Then why do most men act like kindness is weakness?" He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked between them. "Because it costs more than what most are willing to pay." She watched the flames for a moment. "You paid something once. I can see it in you." He didn't look away. "You don't ask many questions, but when you do, they land close." "I don't ask what I don't want the truth for." He stood, brushing sawdust from his boots. "I lost someone," he said, voice low. "Years back. We were driving cattle near the Judith River. Storm came down sudden. He was my brother by bond, not blood. I told him to wait out the water, but he didn't. Got swept under. I pulled him out, but not fast enough. Keziah didn't speak. She stepped forward, slow and steady, until there was only the firelight between them. "I haven't told anyone that since," he said. "You didn't have to," she said. "It shows." He exhaled through his nose, something loosening in the lines around his mouth. "You're not what I expected, neither are you." She reached for his hand. He let her. Her fingers were warm, calloused at the tips, steady as she laced them through his. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. The fire snapped again, and the wind shifted outside, brushing snow against the shutters. Later, when they sat side by side on the floor, her head leaned against his shoulder and his fingers still wrapped around hers, neither moved to break the quiet. The cedar sat untouched beside them, forgotten for now. The night passed slow and long, and neither one of them looked toward the door. The snow turned to ice in November, lining the eaves and stiffening the creek until even the sound of running water vanished. Keziah had taken to using the time after breakfast to mend the seams of the house, chinking gaps along the window frames with moss and large soaked linen. Her fingers red from cold but nimble with purpose. Quillan watched her from the threshold one morning, his hat low against the wind, something unreadable in his eyes. "You always fix things that don't belong to you," he asked. She didn't look up. "They do now." He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The heat from the stove caught his face as he removed his gloves, then moved to hang his coat. "You talk like this place is yours." "I talk like I've been here long enough to care if the wind cuts through the walls." He caught the faint edge in her voice and leaned against the doorframe. "Did someone teach you to be so sharp?" "No," she said, standing and wiping her hands on her skirt. "I learned it, the hard way." He didn't press her. He just watched as she moved toward the hearth and began stirring the pot of beans they'd left warming since early morning. She moved like someone who'd had to earn every inch of peace carefully, but without apology. "I wasn't always like this," she said after a long moment. "I used to be soft-spoken. My brother once told me I'd bend before I ever broke." Quillan stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "So what changed?" She kept stirring. "I did." He waited, but when she didn't offer more, he picked up a tin cup and poured water for them both. When he handed her one, her fingers brushed his, and she held there a second longer than needed. "I left a man behind in Idaho," she said, not looking at him. "He wanted a wife to keep his house and bear his children. I told him I wanted to teach. He called it foolishness. Said a woman with a mind like mine would end up lonely." Quillan didn't look away. "You think he was right?" "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "I think he was scared." He set his cup down beside hers and folded his arms. "What would you teach if you could?" "Letters, arithmetic, geography, if I could find a map that wasn't 10 years out of date." She smiled, faint and wry. "Mostly, I'd teach girls not to believe the first man who tells them what they're worth." He was quiet a moment. "There's a settlement west of here, Green Hollow. They opened a schoolhouse last spring." Miss Ryland mentioned it once, said the teacher they hired was gone before the snow. Keziah blinked. "You think they'd let someone like me teach? You've got a clear voice and a spine." "That's more than most." She studied him, then really studied him, head tilted slightly, eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in measure. "You want me to go?" "No," he said, "but I want you to know you could." That startled her more than any declaration might have. She stepped back from the fire, arms folded. "You're not what I expected, Quillan Pierce." He reached for a stool and sat near the hearth. "What did you expect? Someone who'd take what he wanted and ride on." "I did take something," he said, eyes steady. "But I'm not riding on." She stood in the middle of the room, the quiet pressing in from the frozen woods outside. Then she crossed the space between them and sat on the floor beside him, her hands resting in her lap. "I don't know what to make of this," she admitted. "We don't have to name it yet," he said. "Just let it be." She nodded slow, then leaned her shoulder gently against his knee. He didn't move to touch her, but he stayed there, still and solid as the old pine beams overhead. The fire popped. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing dry needles against the cabin walls. "You didn't ask what happened to my brother," she said. "I figured you'd tell me if you were ready." Her voice dropped. "I found his grave behind the church, shallow but marked. His name was there. A cedar cross with his carving knife wedged into the base. I took the knife." Quillan reached down, his hand warm on her back. "I'm glad you found him. I thought I'd fall apart when I did, but I didn't. I just sat beside the grave and told him I forgave him for leaving me behind." They were quiet for a long stretch after that, the kind of silence that didn't need repair. When the light began to fade, Quillan stoked the fire, and Keziah rose to prepare the evening's bread. As she kneaded the dough, her sleeves rolled high, she glanced back at him. "You ever think about staying put?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, I do now." She nodded once and turned back to her work. The warmth of the room deepened, and though the snow still whispered along the eaves, it no longer felt like it could get inside. By mid-December, the snow lay deep and unmoving, blanketing the woods in silence. Quillan had cleared a path to the smokehouse and another to the well, but the rest of the land remained untouched, hushed beneath its heavy white coat. The sky held the color of pewter more often than not, and the days shrank to bare slivers of light. Inside the cabin, the days had taken on a rhythm both steady and strange, the kind that felt less like waiting and more like settling. Keziah now kept a small shelf above the hearth, lined with the few items she'd salvaged from her journey. A worn leather-bound reader, a tin locket with no chain, and her brother's folding knife, cleaned and oiled. She never spoke of what she'd lost to reach this place, but she no longer carried it in each movement either. That morning, Quillan returned from the ridge with a raw cut along his forearm, shallow but bleeding. He pulled a stool to the table and sat, holding a rag to the wound. Keziah brought the tin of salve from the shelf and knelt beside him. "What'd you catch yourself on?" she asked, dipping a cloth in hot water, fence wire. "One of the posts near the west line's leaning. Snow must have shifted it." She pressed the cloth to his arm. "You should have come back sooner. I didn't want to leave it half fixed, and now you'll bleed through your shirt." He glanced down at her, then back to the fire. "You fuss more than you used to. I earned the right." He let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh. "You did." She tied the bandage firm, then leaned back on her heels. "You know, if you're set on keeping this place from falling apart, you'll need someone watching the line come spring. You volunteering? Depends," she said, rising to her feet. "You offering steady work or just shelter and silence?" He looked at her long, then stood. "Neither. I'm offering a place that feels like it's meant to keep." Her face changed, not softened, but opened. "That what this is now?" He nodded. "If you want it." She stepped closer. "I do." He reached for her hand, not tentative anymore, and she let her fingers curl into his like they'd done it 100 times, not a handful. The room held still around them, the fire casting long shadows against the far wall. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "I think about planting corn on the south slope," he said. "I think about building a bigger table." "A table for more than two," he said. She tilted her head. "You imagining a whole brood, maybe one, maybe two, but not alone." Her voice gentled. "You think I'm made for that? I think you're made for exactly what you choose." She looked into his eyes a long moment, then stepped forward and touched her mouth to his, not rushed, not hesitant. When they parted, her breath lingered with his. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again," she said. "You do here." They spent that evening shelling dried beans and talking about the land, what to plant in spring, what to mend before thaw. She brought up the school in Green Hollow just once, and he listened without interruption. "They'll need someone come April," she said. "Might be I ride out once the river clears. You'd come back," she reached for his hand. "It wouldn't be leaving. It'd be bringing something home." That night, they made a bed together beneath the quilt she'd sewn from worn shirts and flour sacks, and when they lay down, it was with the ease of people who had already chosen each other. The winter passed with its usual bite, but the cold no longer felt sharp. Keziah wrote a letter to the town steward in Green Hollow and received one back, offering her the teaching post by the river. She accepted, and when the ice broke in early March, she rode out with Quillan trailing beside her. They returned a week later with a crate of books and a promise of steady work. By the time the first shoots of green pressed through the thawed soil, Keziah had begun holding lessons in the cabin 2 afternoons a week for the children of nearby trappers and ranch hands. Quillan added a lean-to the side of the house, then a porch, then a second room, each nailed beam and sawn board a quiet vow. They married under the aspens that June, with Miss Ryland standing witness and a cross of cedar carved by Quillan's own hand set behind them. Keziah wore her brother's knife at her hip and her heart on her sleeve, and Quillan said his vows with a voice steady and low. They did not speak of what came before. They had built something new. Years later, the children in Keziah's schoolhouse listened close when she told them stories of rivers that froze and cabins that held, of men who didn't speak too much and women who didn't ask permission to be strong. They never knew the full truth of how she came to the valley, but they knew she walked it as though it had always been hers. And at night, when the fire burned down low and the wind moved soft through the trees, she and Quillan sat on the porch with their palms pressed together, the silence between them full of everything they'd built. They lived long, and they lived steady, and they lived entirely together.